but that's fine. I'm gonna drink my milk. All right. Uh, Here you go. Where is that? All right. So, so in general, we read literature. Okay, literature is something that has to do with imagination, with feelings and creativity, and also literature. Serves to amuse people, to make people, be interested in what you are writing about. And this interest does not mean that you have to write happy or a funny story. No, sometimes you make people, interested in your work, but you write like, very terrible, not terrible, but like, let's say, horrible scenes that may scare some readers. Now here, this is another definition for literature here, which is, and I will read here. But what is literature? Before you open this book, you probably could guess that it would contain the sorts of stories, poems, plays you have encountered in English classes or in the literature section of the library or bookstore. But why are some works called literature whereas others are not? And who gets decide? The American Heritage Dictionary of the English Language offers a number of definitions for the word literature. One of which is, and this is, the definition of literature according to the American Heritage Dictionary, which is an imaginative, and here literature is an imaginative or creative writing, especially recognized artistic value. In this book, in this book, we adopt a version that defines by that def, we adopt a version of that definition by focusing on fictional stories, poems, and plays, the three major kinds of genre of imaginative or creative writing that form the heart of literature as it has been taught in schools and universities for over centuries. Okay, so here you have to understand that we have the word genre here. And what does genre mean? Genre here means kind. It means kind. Genre here means kind. And in literature, as mentioned here, we have three types of genres in literature that we have to focus on. The first genre is fictional stories. That's the first one. The second one is poems. And the third one is plays. So sometimes, if I wanna explain this, this is the whiteboard. Let me use it. Okay. So I don't know if it types here. Let me see. Yeah, the text here. So here, if I want to define or divide literature into genres, so literature is divided into three main genres. Genres mean kinds, okay? Okay, let me center this. I don't know how to center this, but here, yeah. Here you go. So three kinds of genres. Okay. Now, what are these three genres here? So the first one is poetry. Okay. So any poem that you read or you come across is called or is categorized under the genre of poetry. Uh, Now I don't want to give you a lot of types of poems, but let me show you some kinds of poems that we will read in the future. For example, the lyric or the lyrical poetry. Okay, We have, for example, ode. We have ballads. We have sonnets. We have what else? We have uh, free verse poems. We have heroic couplets, and many others. So these are some kinds of poems that we will read. So this is the first genre or kind of literature. Now the second one, which is drama. Drama here has to do with plays or writing, not writing plays, but reading plays. Okay. Now, drama, for example, I'm sure that many of you heard of Shakespeare. And Shakespeare, as many of you know that Shakespeare is a famous person, and he wrote many plays in the past, and everyone is interested in reading his plays. So drama is part or the second genre in literature that we have to understand. Now, what kind of dramas that we have? We have, for example, we have tragedy, we have comedy, we have tragedy, comedy. What else? Tragedy, comedy, and we have also tragedy, comedy, and historical plays. So these are some kinds of drama that we have, and this is the second genre of literature. Now the third and the last one is okay here. Third one is fiction. Okay, or as the book mentioned here, it mentioned fictional stories. Now in fiction, we have many kinds. For example, we have novels. Okay, we have short stories. We have novellas. We have. I mean, these are the main kinds, and also we have biographies. So these are some kinds of fiction. For example, novel. The novel is different from a play, and a novel is different from a poem. So here we have poetry, we have drama, and we have fiction, and these are the three genres of literature. So let me go back. I don't know if I can highlight all this. Let me see. Save. Okay, I saved it now. I want to delete this and go back to share screen. Here's the screen that we were sharing. Okay, so and here so you can understand why we have three genres here: fictional stories, poems, and plays. Okay, and let's continue reading. Many of the works we have chosen to include are already ones of the recognized artistic values, and thus belong to what scholars call the canon. A select, if much debated and if ever evolving, a list of the most highly and widely esteemed works. Though quite few of the literary texts we included are simply too new to have earned that status, they too have already drawn praise and some have generated controversy. So here he just, the author is talking about the canon, and the canon here, he's talking about the major works that we are going to discuss. Like we cannot talk about every literary work in this course, but in this book they choose certain works, and why they choose them? Because they are considered the canon or the most important and well-known works in English or in English literature. Certainly, it helps to bear in mind that with other have thought of literary work, yet one of the book's primary goal is to get you to think for yourself as well as to communicate with others about what imaginative writing, and as you remember, we define literature as an imaginative writing, and artistic value. What do we mean by artistic value? Um, are or might be, and thus what count as literature. What makes a story or poem different from an essay, a newspaper, editorial, or technical manual? So here, these questions, try to distinguish between what we consider as literary and what we consider as, just a regular writing. Okay. Now, why we consider this a story and why we consider this just, an essay or a newspaper? It is because of the artistic value? Is it because of the imaginative writing here? So there are some questions that we will try to answer. Now the next page here. Okay, I don't know if the font is good, but that's the best I can do. What? Okay. Mm-hmm. I just need to minimize this. Okay. All right. So here, as you can see, um, again, we continue, talking about what makes literature literature. So what makes a published canonical story like Herman Melville, Butterby, or The Scavenger, both like and unlike the sort of stories we will teach each other day? What about the so-called oral literature, such as the fables and the folk tales that circulated by words of mouth for hundreds of years before they were ever written down, or published works such as comic strips and graphic novels that rely little, if at all, on the written word, or Harlequin romances, television shows, and the stories you collaborate in making when you play a video game? Likewise, how is Shakespeare's poems? My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun, sorry. Both like and unlike verse you might find in a Hallmark card or even in a jingle in a mouthwash commercial. So simply here, this paragraph talks about, sorry, this paragraph, the whole paragraph talks about uh, what is considered as literature and what is considered as not literature. In fact, what this paragraph is saying is that it is hard to define or to decide what is literary and what is not literary. Why? Because if you think that literature is imaginative and has artistic value, what about the stories that we hear from our parents and grandparents, for example? They tell us stories, the folk stories, right? So are they literature? Because they are imaginative and they have artistic value. So are they literature? So simply in the end, there's a difficulty in defining literature, and the best way to look at literature is that literature has to be, or not has to be, but it may include imagination, and also it may have artistic value. I said it may because not every literary work has these features. um, so the next paragraph here, it talks about literature departments offer courses in many of these forms of expressions, expanding the realm of literature far beyond the limits of the dictionary definition. An essay is a song lyric, a screenplay, a supermarket romance, a novel by Toni Morrison or William Faulkner, a poem by Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson. Each may be read and interpreted in literary ways that yield insight and pleasure. What makes the literary way of reading different from pragmatic reading is, a scholar Lousy Rosbalt explains, and that it does not focus on what will remain after the reading, the information to be acquired, the logical solution to a problem, the actions to be carried, but rather on what happened uh, on what happened during the reading. The difference between pragmatic and literary reading, in other words, and here it is very important here to distinguish between these two things, and I may ask you in the exam about that, is that In other words, resembles or reading literature resembles the difference between a journey that is only about reaching a destination and one that is much about fully experiencing the ride. So the difference here between reading literature and reading any other work is that it's like two journeys that you have. One journey is that you want to reach your destination, so you want to reach the last point, or you want to arrive to the place that you're going to. This is called pragmatic reading. But the literary reading, you are going to enjoy the drive. Okay. For example, if you want to go to your school to study, that's called pragmatic reading because you want to reach the school and you want to study. But if you want to go and drive in the streets of Aqaba, or you want to go to Wadi Rum and enjoy the road and see the trees and the mountains and the beautiful stuff, this is called the literary reading. So that's the difference between literary, what we mean by reading literature, or reading literary, and reading pragmatically. In the page of this book, you will find cartoons, an excerpt from a graphic novel, song lyrics, folk tales, and stories and plays that have spawned movies. Through this inclusiveness, we do not intend to suggest that there are no distinction among these various forms of expressions or between a good story, poem, a play, and bad one. Rather, we want to get you thinking, talking, and writing about what the key difference and similarities among these forms are and what make one work better example of its genre another. Sharpening your skills at these peculiarly intensive and responsive sorts of reading and interpretation is primarily purpose of this book and most of the literature. Okay, so here there is nothing important here. Another goal of inclusiveness is simply to remind you that literature does not belong in a textbook or a classroom, even if textbook, classroom are essential means for expanding your knowledge of the literary terrain of the concepts and teachings and techniques essential throughout to thoroughly enjoy and understand a broad range of literary forms. You may or may not be the kind of person who always take the novel when you go to the beach or secretly write a poem about your experience when you get back home. You may or may not have taken a literature course or courses before, yet you already have a good deal of literary experience and even expertise, as well as much more to discover about literature. A major aim of this book is to make you conscious of how and to what end you might use the tools you already possess and to add many new ones to your tool belt. So simply here, what is he saying in this paragraph, this one, is that um, most of the time, most of the time people read literature for pleasure. So if you go to the beach, if you go to if you go from Amman to Aqaba, or if you go to any place, you'll find people having books and reading. So they are reading what? They are reading literature. So, and this is one of the misconceptions about literature that students have. Literature is something for pleasure, that you enjoy reading literature. I enjoy reading short stories, novels, poems, and all kind of stuff. And I don't know why students find it, a burden and a difficulty to read literature. Literature is for fun. It's for finding pleasure and joy. So in this case, yes, you study literature in classroom and as a textbook, but at the same time, there are some stuff that you will feel excited about, and you will find pleasure and joy in reading literature, and that's what the book is about. Okay, so what does literature do? Okay, this is a very important question. What does literature do? One quality that may will differentiate stories, poems, and plays from other kinds of writing is that they help us move beyond and probe beneath abstraction. So that's the first thing. So they help us is that they help us move beyond and probe beneath abstraction by giving us concrete and vivid particulars. Okay, how? Because literature allows us to go beyond the abstract world. So for example, if I keep explaining to you the moon, you will not be able to understand it because it's an abstract. You don't have a clear image of it. But when you read a literary work about the moon, so this abstract thing will be actualized and will be, put into life. Okay. And that's why, it is more concrete. It's more concrete rather than abstract. Rather than thinking about things, they bring them to life for us by representing experience, and so they become an experience for us. One that engages our emotions, imaginations, and all of our senses as well as our intellect. So, simply here, what the literature guys do is that they represent. So, they bring the abstract things to life by what? By representing experience, and so they become an experience for us, one that engages our emotions, imaginations, and after all, senses, and well, as well as our intellect. So, what does that mean? It means that uh, literature creates life, it creates the past. So, let's say Shakespeare. Now, when we read Shakespeare, okay, simply we find Shakespeare creating the life of the 16th century. So we, as readers, when we read Shakespeare's, we go back 4 or 5 or 600 years ago to see what was going on at that time. And this is how literature, operates. Is that anything that is abstract become actualized and become or is represented by the the work itself. And in this case, because of this creation and bringing things into life, we engage our emotions and imagination in this kind of work. As the British, and then I will continue reading now. As the British poet and critic Matthew Arnold put it more than a century ago, the interpretation of science do not give us this intimate sense of objects as the interpretation of poetry give us. They appeal to a limited faculty and not to the whole man. It is not Linus who gave us the true sense of animals or water or plants, who sees the secret for us, who makes us participate in their life. It is Shakespeare, Wordsworth, and Keats. So here again, this is like, it supports the idea that I explained here, which is this is very important, by the way. This explains that, that these writers such as Shakespeare, Wordsworth, and Keats, these are literary work, or the literary writers, or writers of literature. They give life to animals, water, and plants more than the science itself. The science describe life, but literature gives life to life. What does that mean? Is that, science can explain that this is a rock or this is a mountain, but in literature, mountain can speak and can talk. A stone can speak and talk. So simply, literature can represent and can allow, things to speak and to interact with human beings. And that's why, literature has an upper hand over other, fields of science. To test Arnold's theory, compare the American Heritage Dictionary rather than dry definition of literature with the following poem, in which John Keats described his first encounter with a specific literary work. George Chapman, translation of the Iliad and the Odyssey, two epics by the ancient Homer. Okay, so wait, which page is this? I think let's go to page 4. Now look at this poem. We will look at closely at this poem and explain it to you. Okay, but just we will explain it in general. This is a poem by the poet John Keats, and let me read it, and then we will comment on some of the stuff here. Much I have traveled in the realm of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Round many western islands have I been, which bards in fealty to Apollo's hold. Oft of one wide expanse I had been told, that deep bode Homer ruled, abode Homer ruled as his dimensive. Yet did I never breathe its pure serene, till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. Then felt I like some water of the skies when a new planet swims into his ken, or like stout cords when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak in a daring. So here, this is a poem, and I'll explain it to you now. I'll show you what it means here. Uh, just give me a second. Okay. So here, now the speaker here, or the person who speaks this, the speaker here, that is talking here in this poem, said, "Much have I traveled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen." Now, these two lines explains that, as a poet, you allow this person to travel in the realm of goals. Why you are allowed to travel in the realm of goals? Because simply you have imagination. You do it not in actual life, but you do it in imagination, and that's why literature gives you life to do this. Okay, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. So the speaker is saying here that he went to many countries and many kingdoms. He saw many countries and many kingdoms. He saw it through imagination as well. The speaker may not, have left his country, but through imagination, he can go to all countries all over the world. And this is again, this can be done by literature, because in literature you can create life. Round many western islands have I been, which bars in fealty to Apollo hold. And here he also talks about the islands, many western islands that I have been, which bars in fealty to Apollo hold. All these islands he visited, through literature. And here you have note number one. You see that note number one here? I want you to go to foot number one here. Sorry, number two. Apollo here, it explains Apollo is a Greek god of poetry and music. Fealty, literary, the loyalty owed by a vassal to his feudal lord. So simply here, the, 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 the poem here, we have note number two, explain who is Apollo. Apollo is a Greek god, okay, and he's a god of music and god of poetry, okay. And now the writer is saying that, or the speaker is saying that he is able to travel, he's able to see many states and kingdoms, and he is able to go to the past, to the Greek past, and this can be done only through literature. Literature is the only thing that can take you to the past. There is nothing that can take you to the past unless you are imaginative and use your imagination, and this is through literature. Again, the whole poem, I don't want to read the whole poem, because the whole poem is focusing on how literature, has the power to create life and to take you beyond the actual life that you live in. Okay, through literature, like for example, me as a teacher, through literature, I can go to Barcelona now. I can go to Madrid. I can go to Sydney, because simply I am imagining things and I can write things, but I can't do it in actual life because we are in the corona, virus age, and we cannot leave the country. So in actual life, you cannot leave the country, but in the imagination, you can do it. Okay, so here, this is an explanation. Okay. All right. Just wanna do something here. Let's see. No, let me just return. Okay. So Keats makes us see literature as a wild expanse by greatly developing this metaphor and contemplating it with similes, likening reading to the sighting of a new planet and the first glimpse of an undiscovered oceans. More important, he shows us what literature means and why it matters by allowing us to share with him the subject, the subjective experience of reading, and the complex sensation it inspires. The dizziness, the dizzying exhilaration of discovery, the sense of power, accomplishment, and the pride that comes of achieving something difficult, the wonder we feel in those rare moments when we much anticipate experience turn out to be even greater than we had imagined. So these are some of the things that created by literature is that we have this sense of power, accomplishment, we have this sense of power, accomplishment, and pride that comes of achieving something difficult, the wonder we feel, and those rare moments when we much anticipate experience and turn out to be greater than we had imagined it would be. So that's how literature affect us as readers, how it influences us as readers. Uh, yeah. Okay. So it isn't the definition of the word alone that bring this experience to life for us as we read Keats' poems, but also their sensual quality, the way the word look, sound, and even feel in our mouth because of the particular way they are put together on the page. So here simply, this poem is able to take us into another world, okay, through words and through sounds and through sensual qualities. Sensual here, it has to do with the senses, like, feeling, smelling, smiling, all kinds of senses, okay? The sensation of excitement, of racing heart and mind, is reproduced in us when we read the poem. For example, notice how the lines in the middle run into each other, but but then Keats forces us to slow down at the poem's end, stopped short by the dash and comma in the poem's final line. And as okay, generally speaking, here, just this paragraph talks about how literature through words, or how this poem through words can create a life and can take us to another realm and into another world. Okay, what are what are the genres of literature? Do you remember the whiteboard that I show you here? This will explain what I explained to you before, the genres of literature, but we will read it to understand it more fully here. The conversation that is literature, as well as the conversation about literature, invite all comers requiring neither a visa nor a special license of any kind. Yet, literary studies, like all disciplines, have developed its own terminology and its own system of classification, helping you understand effectively use both is a major focus of this book. Especially important terms appear in bold throughout and are defined in a glossary at the back. Okay. Some essential literary terms are common everyday words used in a special way in the conversation about literature. A case in point, perhaps, is the literary criticism, as well as the closely related term literary critic. Despite the usual connotation of the word criticism, literary criticism is called criticism not because it is negative or corrective, but rather because those who write criticism ask searching, analytical, critical questions about the works that they read. Literary criticism is both the process of interpreting and commenting on literature and the result of that process. If you write an essay on the play Hamlet, the poetry of John Keats, or the development of the short story in the 1990s, you engage in literary criticism. And by writing the essay, you become literary critic. So here, there are many terms that we will be introduced to in literature, and some of these terms, or one of these terms is literary criticism or literary critic. What do we mean by literary criticism and literary critic? Here, as mentioned here in this paragraph, literary criticism does not mean negative or positive or corrective as you think, because the word criticism. When you say you criticize someone, it means that you negatively talk about this person. But in literature, literary criticism has different meaning. Literary criticism in literature means that you read the play, you try to understand it, you ask some questions, and you try to connect between the points. Okay, that's what literary criticism. And when you do this, you become a literary critic. So simply, now you, the students of literature in this class, are all literary critic, Why you are a literary critic? Because you are going to read literature and you are going to analyze literature, and you engage in this thought process by trying to understand literary works. Similarly, when we classify works of literature, we use terms that may be familiar to you, but you have specific meanings in a literary context. All academic disciplines have system of classification or taxonomies as well as jargons. Biologists, for example, classify all organisms into a series of ever smaller and more specific categories. Kingdom, phylum, division, class, order, family, that's not important. Classification and comparison are just essential in the study of literature. We expect a poem to work in a certain way. For example, when we know from the outset that it is a poem and not, say, a factual news report or reports or a short story, and whether um, consciously or not consciously we compare it as we read to other poem we have read in the past. If we know further that the poem was first published in the 18th century, we expect to work differently from one that appeared in the latest New Yorker. Indeed, we often choose what to read just as we choose what movie to see, based on the class or the order of the book or the movie we like, or what we are in the mood for the day, the horror, comedy, action, or science fiction. So simply here, this paragraph, the whole paragraph talks about the specific terminologies or the specific terms that are associated with literature. Okay. In every discipline, in every field, there are specific words and specific jargons and specific vocabulary that are used in this or that field. The same thing with literature. There will be some words and some definitions that we have to be familiar with in literature. And that's why, we will try to see what kind of words and what kind of terminology that we need to understand in literature. All right, so I ask you to read page number 6. So that's I think that's the last. That's the last. Yeah. Okay. Just let's read the last line because it's connected to the next page. The way we classify a work depends on. Oh wait. Where did we stop? Yeah, here. Sorry, I jumped. I'm sorry. Page number 5. As these examples suggest, we generally tend to categorize literary works into two ways. One on the basis of contextual factors and especially historical or cultural context. That is when, by whom, and where it was produced, as in 19th century literature, the literature of the Harlem Renaissance, American literature, or African American literature, or on the basis of formal textual features. For example, for the later type of classification, the one we focus on in this book, the key term is genre, which simply means, as the Oxford Dictionary tells us, a particular style or category of work of art, especially a type of literary work that characterized by a particular form, style, or purpose. Okay, now here there are two things that you have to understand is that the classification of literature, when we categorize literary works, you can categorize them in two ways. Either you categorize them through history or cultural context, such as you say 19th century literature, 20th century literature, the literature of the Renaissance, etc. That's because you categorize literature based on history or cultural context. But there is another way for classification of literature, which is the formal or textual features. Now, what are the formal features of a poem? What are the formal features of a play? What are the formal features of of a novel or fiction in general? So there are two ways. Either you distinguish or categorize literature historically, or you do it through formal textual features. Now, I think we are going to focus more on the formal textual features here, or we will focus on the second point. And here is another, an interesting definition for genre. You may consider this as a definition for genre here. Okay, so genre means, as the Oxford Dictionary tells us, a particular style or category of work of art, a type of literary work characterized by a particular form, style, or purpose. Now, why we call, as I said before, why we call this a play? because simply a play has certain formal features. Why we call this a poem? Because a poem is different from a play. Why we call this fiction or a novel? Because a novel is different from a poem and is different from a play. So these formal features divide literature into genres or into types, into genres or into types. Apply rigorously, genre refers to the largest categories around which this book is categorized: fiction, poetry, drama. And I think I mentioned this in the whiteboard that I mentioned before. The word subgenres applies to smaller divisions with genres and word kind to subdivision within subgenres. Subgenres of fiction include the novel, novella, and short story. Do you remember that at the beginning of the class? I talked about this. So we have genres, main genres, three main genres: poetry, fiction, drama. And we have then subgenres. In poetry, we have lyrics, we have ballads, we have odes. In drama, we have tragedy, we have comedy, we have tragicomedy. In fiction, we have novella, we have novel, and we have short stories. So we have the three main genres, and we have many subgenres. Okay. Kinds of novel, in turn, include things like the Buildings roman or the epistolary novel. Similarly, important subgenres of nonfiction, including the essay as well as biography and autobiographies, and the memoir in particular of a particular, and so on. So here, simply, what the author is saying is that the first thing that comes is the genre, and then we have the subgenres, and then we have under the subgenres we have other divisions and divisions and divisions for literature. Okay. However, the terms of literary criticism are not so fixed and so constantly rigorously used as a biologist are. You will often see the word genre applied both much more narrowly, referring to the novel, for example, or even to the kind of novel such as the episode novel or the historical novel. The way we classify a work depends on which aspect of its form and style we concentrate on, and categories may overlap. When we divide fiction, for example, when we divide fiction, for example, and look at the interesting definite the division of fiction into subgenres: novels, novella, and short story. We take the length of the work as the salient aspect. Novels are much longer than the short story, but other fictional subgenres, detective fiction, gothic fiction, historical fiction, science fiction, and even romance, are based on the types of a plot, characters, and settings, and so on, that are customarily featured in these works. These later categories may include works from all other length-based categories. There are, after all, Gothic novels, think Stephen Mayer's, as well as Gothic short stories, think Edgar Allan Poe. So here, simply what's going on here is that they give you example of how genres and subgenres are divided. For example, what is the difference between a novel? The difference between a novella, and short story. Now, a novel is much, and as mentioned, the novels are much longer than short stories. So if you read, for example, a 10 or 20 page book, that's called a short story. But if you read 300 or 400 pages, that's called a novel. Now, a novella comes in between. It's shorter than a novel and bigger than a short story. So it's novella is like 60 to 80, maybe 100 pages. That's called novella. So novel is the largest one, short story the smallest one, and in between you have the novel. These are the main three subgenres of fiction. Okay, but we also can categorize, as we can see here, but other fictional subgenres: detective fiction, gothic fiction, historical fiction, science fiction, and even romance, are based on the type of the plot, characters, and settings. So what does that mean? It means that not all the time we divide subgenres according to their length, like the novel, novella, and short stories, or according to the word count, bigger, smaller. But sometimes we categorize them according to their plots, characters, and settings. For example, if we have a story that has a detective, like we have a crime and a detective. So this is called, It's called a detective fiction. If we have a story that talks about history in the past, then this is called historical fiction. If we have a story that talks about horror and jinnis, ghosts, and all kind of crazy stuff, this is called gothic fiction. So in this case, these categories here are divided according to the plot. So according to the plot, what kind of content is there, and according to characters, what kind of characters we have here, and according to the settings. For example, look at the historical fiction. If we have in the historical fiction, if we have let's say Iraq in the 16th century or in the 15th century. Okay, that's a historical fiction, right? And if we have, for example, figures like famous figures, but real figure, that's called also historical fiction. Gothic fiction, when we have these crazy jinnis and ghosts and crazy stuff, that's called gothic fiction. And detective, you know what detective is, which has to do with a crime that cannot be solved, and there is a detective who try to find or solve the problem. Science fiction also, it has to do with science. I think Harry Potter is a science fiction, and I'm sure that some of you have read this. And romance also is another story about love, etc., and etc. Okay, so these are the way we categorize fiction. Another thing here, a few genres even cut across the boundaries, dividing poetry, fiction, and drama, and nonfiction. A prime example is satire. Any literary work, whether a poem, a play, fiction, or nonfiction, in which prevailing vices and follies are held up by ridicule. Examples of satire may include poems such as Pope's Dunisade, plays, movies, and televisions from the multi whatever names here. Okay, the work. Okay, okay. Three other major genres that cross the borders between fiction, poetry, and nonfiction are parody and pastoral and romance. So here, what is going on here in this paragraph is that there are a few genres that can cut across the boundaries of poetry, fiction, and drama and nonfiction. What does that mean? It means that before we divide genres according to the length, according to the content, the plot, the character, the setting. But now we have a problem, which is that sometimes a few genres can be found not only in one kind of literature, but in different kinds of literature. For example, satire. Satire can be found in three: in fiction, in poetry, and drama. Satire can be found in fiction, poetry, and drama, and this is called cross or what they call it here, cross the borders. Cross the borders. It means that it moves from fiction to drama to poetry. One of these things is called satire. What is satire? Now here is the definition of satire. Uh, any literary work, whether a poem, play, or fiction, in which the prevailing vices and follies are held up to ridicule. Okay, it means that it ridicule or make fun of the follies or the vices of the people. So and that's called satire. When you criticize a society by making fun of them. And these are just some examples of satire. I don't think it's important to know. Just read these words, but know that satire is a cut across the boundaries of genres. And the last line is very important, which is there are other major genres that cross the boundaries or the borders between fiction, poetry, and drama and nonfiction, such as parody, pastoral, and romance. You may look up these words in the dictionary because I cannot explain every word here, and they will be explained later on too. Individual work can thus be belong simultaneously to multiple generic categories and observe some conventions of genre without being example of that genre in any simple or straightforward way. The Old English poem Beowulf is an epic, and because it is written in verse, a poem, yet because like all epics, it narrates a story and it is a work of fiction in the more general sense of the term. So this paragraph, talks about how genres sometimes, can be collapsed in the sense that sometimes genres can be both, or not only both, but they can be fiction, poetry, and drama, fiction, poetry, and drama. For example, Beowulf, that's one of the old poems, okay? It can be read as a fiction, it can be read as a poem, and it can also be read as a drama or as a play because it has characters, it has acting. So in this case, genre sometimes collapse and sometimes, can move from one genre, subgenre, one genre to another. That's all for today. I know that's just too much stuff that we explained today. I hope that this video will be very clear. And what I want you to do, guys, is that please read the book by yourself and look at the video and listen to what I said. And if you have any question, please write it down. You may ask me, or we may have another class to explain some of the points of confusion that you have. Thank you very much for today and have a wonderful and blessing day.